trust your instincts on that.
Yeah.
I have no doubt that there's some selective reporting, conscious or unconscious, going on. No argument on there. But the point is, Kharkiv is still there. Mariupol is still there. They've been under shelling for 20 days. There's been a dozen assaults on Kiev. All of them have been repulsed. But the real big one for me was that 40-mile-long convoy. It stalled a day in because it ran out of gas. And then 2 days later, the Russian troops abandoned it and walked back to Belarus because they ran out of food. That should not happen to the tip of your spear.
Right.
There's a large history of corruption throughout the Russian system, the military included. But we thought, and when I say we, I mean everyone who's ever studied Russia in the last 30 years, we thought they learned all those lessons after Grozny. We thought they learned them after the Second Chechen War, because by the end of the Second Chechen War in 2001, they weren't doing this anymore. But here we are 20 years later, and despite a couple significant international deployments, and all of a sudden it feels like we're back in 1993.
Why did they go back to Belarus?
If the number is 25%, that's more than enough. Because if you're all advancing down a single highway, 3 or 4 vehicles blocking a convoy, everybody just has to stop. I mean, just the very approach to this is not a problem necessarily with logistics. It shows a level of incompetence on strategic thinking. You know, you're talking 1,000+ vehicles in a single file line, 40 miles long. I'm sorry, that's idiotic. And here we are. So it's looking like a catastrophic failure to perform across the entire system.
What happened to those?
But you have to secure the land first, because if you get one stick of dynamite under one railroad tie and you set it off at the right moment, the trading pileup that happens because of that is absolutely epic. So you only do that once you've actually pacified the countryside, and I would argue in the case of Ukraine, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, like ever. The insurgency.
There's a certain degree of insurgency. I mean, let me back up. The Russians are going to still win despite all of this. They outnumber the Ukrainians. They've got better equipment. They've got shorter supply lines. They don't have to worry about controlling their borders in order to keep the resources coming. They can suck up a huge amount of casualties, and Russian society will not rebel. Remember, it wasn't until you had almost 1 million dead in World War I that we had any inkling of political problems back in Russia. We're nowhere close to that. And a lot of Russians agree with what Putin is doing, either for nationalist reasons or for strategic reasons. So these reports that we do see about people fleeing Russia, they are true. There are dissidents. They are not going to win. So far, all of the protests combined, still talking less than 1/10% of the population. That doesn't move the needle in a dictatorship.
Right, yeah, that's a good point.
And so Russia's going to win this. And then they're going to have to pacify the country. And the question is, what level of internal violence and sabotage are they willing to tolerate in order to move on to the next stage of the war? And that's where things get interesting from the NATO point of view.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that was coloring American decision-making on all things Russian, it's that they were maybe not a pure force, but a near pure force. And we would have to be very careful how we operated. We would have to be at the top of our game if we weren't going to have horrendous casualties. All of a sudden, that logic's gone out the window. And we now know that if American forces and Russian forces meet on the field of battle, the Russian forces will be obliterated. And if that happens, the only choice the Russians have is between a humiliating strategic withdrawal to do whatever the Americans say, or up the ante with nukes. And so from the White House, from the DOD's point of view, this has gotten a lot scarier than we ever thought it would be. Because all of a sudden, if we can't keep Russia locked down in Ukraine, if we can't bleed them there till they die, if we can't make it out of their reach so that they can then go on and do the next series of targets, then there will be a direct American-Russian confrontation that we can't avoid, because these are NATO allies. So the NATO strategy, the White House strategy now, is to ship every piece of military equipment that we can that doesn't require a static physical resupply or launching point like a plane. So drones are good, anti-tank missiles are good, Stingers are good, anything like that's great. Send it all. Because as long as Russia is bogged down in a bloodbath in Ukraine, they can't go to the next step, and that's where the American troops are. That logic hasn't changed. The only thing that has changed is that because the Russians now appear so weak, the degree of desperation that might exist in their strategic thinking is something that we really hadn't taken into account earlier. It's the same basic concept as what's going on with the military and the economy. You know, the last group of people who have the full suite of training were trained in the mid-1980s. In the case of the leadership specifically, we're talking about all people from the KGB. When Yuri Andropov took over in the early 1980s, it was a bit of an internal coup in that we had one faction that used to be part of the government take over the government because they thought that the previous two rulers, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, had mismanaged the system so badly that they really needed adults in the room, people who had the full picture of everything that was going on. And in a highly censored totalitarian dictatorship, that meant the intelligence services. So the KGB generated Yuri Andropov, Chernenko, and ultimately Gorbachev, all from the KGB, to run the system. Well, these people stayed in, I wouldn't even call it the background. They weren't officially in charge, but they were always large and present in the 1990s. And when Yeltsin took ill, they're the ones who took over from Yeltsin. So we had a quick revolution, lasted a few years, then Yeltsin got dropped because his health was atrocious. And the KGB has been in the KGB's successor, the FSB, has been in charge of ever since. Now, Putin is obviously from that crowd, but so has everyone around him. Alexei Miller of Gazprom is probably the best example. But the chiefs of all of the major companies that they're called the Silivarchs, the security oligarchs, that have taken over chunks of the Russian economy in large bites ever since 1999. They are all personally beholden to Putin. They are all from that inner circle, and they are all over 50. So there is not a generation waiting in the wings that has been trained. Putin has been very effective at pruning any potential challengers to his rule. So he will be the last capable, competent president of the Russian Federation. The best case scenario is we get something a little bit like what happened after Mao left in China, like a gang of 4 from the different factions who rules as a committee, and then one of the 4 offs the other 3, and then he's in charge. That's kind of the best case scenario now. I think it'd be more likely that Putin has so removed everyone of leadership talent that we're probably going to have more of an organizational collapse. Igor Sechin of Rosneft, that's the state oil company, is probably the most capable who's left, but everyone else of the 150 KGB members that are left so thoroughly hate him in all things that it's really doubtful that he'd be able to rally anyone to his flag. So there really is no one.
To me, it just
also sounds a lot like an American position. We look at leadership different than the Russians do. The strong man is who rules Russia. It always has been. The terrain does not lead to regional leaders, or regional economics that are separate. So like, here, Texas, New York, California, Florida, Minnesota, these are all discrete economic entities. And so we have a federal system where each of the states chooses their own leadership and then submits their leadership choices at a representative level to Washington. That would never work in the Russian Federation.